Hello there everyone. So recently I was watching a really interesting video on the relationship between corporatism and world music, and in that video he was talking about how in the 90s there was this new wave of corporate symbolism that was communicating themes of a global unity and a romantic representation of various ethnic cultures. This was disseminated through commercial advertisements and new age or world music, as it was known back then, which sometimes exploited the ethnic groups that they sampled from, incorporating their traditional songs into commercial music tracks without properly compensating or even acknowledging them. And I remember being somewhat taken in by this romantic symbolism. We used to listen to cassettes of groups like Enigma and Deep Forest while travelling around in the car, and I remember being emotionally affected by it. Thankfully I didn't indulge in it beyond a surface aesthetic level, though I do distinctly remember this implied message of solidarity and a suggestion that people living in some remote, exotic locale were living simpler, healthier, and somehow more authentic lives than we were. The secondary implication was that we should accept a universal identity and consider an integration with the other as something to strive for. There was even a song by Enigma that was called Return to Innocence. It seemed like the more remote a culture was, the more authentic it was. The other's culture became a beacon that could show us the error of our ways and lead us out of the quagmire of materialistic consumerism, if only through a romantic indulgence in displays of ethnic fetishism. The irony that this superficial assessment that was being communicated by giant multinational media corporations selling us this message on their products seemed to go over the heads of most people at the time. It certainly went over mine. And this video got me thinking about a book that I'd been reading called Sick Societies by Robert B. Edgerton. In the book he challenges some major assumptions that circulate through the field of anthropology, namely the romantic consideration of primitive peoples as being more in tune with nature, more egalitarian, and better adapted to harmonious living than modern people living in large-scale, technologically advanced societies. In some anthropological circles, it's even frowned upon to suggest that primitive societies might possess dysfunctional elements, despite the abundance of evidence accumulated by anthropologists themselves confirming such is the case, and a poverty of data supporting the romantic view. This in-house preference is of course the product of overly earnest Westerners projecting their own affections and sensitivities into the lives of tribal people. Such primitive tribes are not merely a subject of great curiosity for the Western academic. They can just as easily become symbols that harmonize into the symbolism of those corporate and New Age sentiments, exotic caricatures that reflect more about the way that we think than about how tribal societies work in reality. Edgerton also mentions that there has been something of a benevolent conspiracy among many anthropologists who feel that they are betraying the trust of those people whom they have lived and studied by exposing their darker underbelly to the world. And if the presence of dysfunctional behaviour becomes unavoidable, it easily dissolves into apologetics, abdicating ownership of responsibility from the perpetuators and passing it over to an explanation that interference by colonialism has stolen them out of their state of innocence. Edgerton's book penetrates straight into the heart of this romantic sentiment and returns to us the image of human beings in their universal state of crisis. A sobering reminder that, under trying circumstances, our mind modulates into dark corners, regardless of who we are, the cultural conditions that we were raised in, or levels of technological advancement. His book offers us another image of tribal humanity raw and real, stripped of its taboos, obfuscations, and delusions of grandeur, like a good anthropology should. It also demonstrates that far from being better adjusted by their distance from the modern world, tribal societies foster all kinds of practices, beliefs, and prejudices that contribute enormously to their own suffering and they continue to enact them in spite of it. And what I want to do in this video is exemplify some choice examples from the book that speak to the realities of tribal life. I do this not to paint a negative image of tribal peoples as regressive or backwards, for that would simply exchange one set of distortions for another. Rather, I want us to understand that human beings are not caricatures. We are complex creatures with complex personal psychologies, and we sensitively reflex to changing conditions that in turn influence our behaviour. In addition, there is no such thing as an innocent human being, even children. We all share a universal capacity for kindness and harmony, as much as we do for malevolence and dysfunctionality. These are realities of life that both romantics and prejudice distance us from. So with all that being said, let's proceed to the first segment. Despite the influence of cultural narratives that help to promote the image of its opposite, social inequality is a universal reality all the way from primitive societies to modern city-states. Rousseau and Karl Marx believed that there was once an unspoiled period of social equality found exclusively in small-scale societies, and that with the coming of civilization, this equality had been deharmonized in favor of arbitrary differentiation and exploitation. Economic anthropologists, inspired by this notion, have even suggested that in primitive societies, there was simply no need to exploit each other, since all the necessities of life were in ample supply. However, an assessment of the historical record does not bear this to be the case. In fact, as Robert Edgerton points out in his book, until quite recently, all human societies place the well-being of adults above that of children, and with few exceptions, men have placed their own interests above that of women. Men's subjugation of women is a historical reality. However, the picture of this reality has been so polluted in recent decades that the truth is not so easy to capture. If we draw back from the contemporary confusion surrounding this matter, what emerges is a wide variety of expression, ranging anywhere from benevolent cooperation to outright subjugation. And it goes both ways. Even in restrictive societies, females have always possessed some rights and powers, and this has enabled them to formulate strategies that press to their advantage in certain areas of life, even to directly impose their will upon men in return. Nonetheless, men have always held the primal advantage, in the sense that they've always been able to impose their will through physical means, thereby architecting the nature of social arrangements on their terms. In most primitive societies, men have traditionally occupied the role of hunter and warrior protector, searching for and killing game, and determining the outcomes of intertribal conflicts over territorial and resource claims. Women, on the other hand, have obviously had to fulfill their biological prerogative of life bearers, with additional manual tasks included, such as agricultural work and preparing the game that the men have captured. However, this arrangement has not been without its disharmonies. In the Chukchi of Siberia, the men would hunt and carry back the game, usually a large reindeer. Then, after the women had spent hours butchering and cooking the meat, the men would eat their fill, leaving only scraps for the women. When asked by anthropologists about this arrangement, the men simply replied, "Being women, eat crumbs." In many workplaces in the Western world, it's simply taken for granted that if heavy work has to be done, then a team of males will see to it. This is not the case in many primitive societies. Women are often called upon to carry extremely heavy loads containing resources such as water and wood, while men stand around idle holding their weapons. The justification that is commonly given is that the men have to perform the important role of protecting the women and the resources from invaders, which I'm sure has some truth to it, but there is no doubt that this reason is exploited by the men to get out of doing manual work. And even after colonial forces curtailed a lot of tribal conflict, meaning that there was less imperative to carry weapons around, this working relationship still remained. In all societies, there are important services that both men and women need to perform, though if relations between the two get so hostile, women may refuse to provide some of the services to the men, which in turn fosters more resentment and paves a path for dysfunctional behaviour to emerge. There is an incredible case of the Gusii in Western Kenya, who had formed a bizarre social arrangement. These tribes were perpetually at odds over grudges stemming from age-old historical conflicts. In addition, they were all exogamous, meaning that they could only marry suitors from outside of their own group. They even had a proverb to this: "Those whom we marry are those whom we fight." This obviously provided the Gusii with a dilemma, but instead of pacifying social relations through diplomacy, they deliberately made matters worse. Whenever a groom from a neighbouring tribe came to visit the bride's family home before the wedding ceremony, he would be greeted by a mob of aggressive women who mocked his appearance and accused him of being impotent on the wedding night. Likewise, when the bride came to visit the groom's family home, she would be accosted by a similar band of women, who hurled insults at her, pinched her, and tried to wipe animal dung on her lips before allowing her to enter the home. And it wasn't over yet. On the wedding night, the bride would adamantly refuse to consummate the marriage, going to such lengths as tying the pubic hairs over her vagina together. Such behaviour in tribal societies is actually a common tradition. Displays of resistance are seen as part of the mating ceremony, even if they are made in a purely symbolic gesture. But in the case of the Gusii, this was certainly more animus than tradition. If the groom was having trouble with a particularly uncooperative bride, he would simply get a gang of men from the tribe together to restrain her and rape his new wife on the spot. After this initial rite was over, it was customary for the husband to initiate intercourse as many times as he liked, the more the better, resulting in great pain for the female involved. For the Gusii, such exhibitions of sexual hostility were not only reserved for married couples, it went on between tribal members as well. Adolescent boys recuperating from the coming-of-age circumcision would be cruelly tormented by the younger females of the tribe in a custom known as Ogosonya. With malicious intent, the girls would disrobe and dance provocatively around the boys, goading them to have intercourse while simultaneously making disparaging remarks about their genitals. The boys, incapable of performing even if they wanted to, would try their best to refrain, but their bodies simply reacted to the display, causing a painful and bloody erection as their healing scabs burst open. Such sights were treated by the girls as a triumphant success. They had no intention of coupling with the boys, they just wanted to see them suffer. Such case examples evidence that human opportunism and regressive behaviour are universals and are not as tied to material development as many academics have liked to believe. For primitive peoples, these behaviours are usually facilitated by long-standing traditional beliefs that act as a vehicle for their perpetual retransmission into their lives. As we'll see now, certain beliefs can have disastrous consequences, not only for individuals, but for entire kingdoms as well. In the book Culture Against Man, Jules Henry wrote that man's ultimate problem was learning to live with himself. On the one hand, we have to contend with the irresistible forces of our biological nature, while simultaneously operating within a culture complex that incessantly tries to exert influence over those forces. As Robert Edgerton points out, humans are forever betwixt and between, required to wring satisfaction from a culture that represses many aspects of human nature, yet still dependent on that culture for all that gives meaning to life. And in order to survive, not simply as a species but as a distinct societal entity, All human groups have to curtail upon behaviours that engender societal dysfunction, deception, greed, aggression, licentiousness, to name but a few. Many of these elements can be rationally traced back to some genetic point of origin, hygiene and licentiousness being obvious choices. However, not all destructive practices necessarily correlate to a rational origin. The May Enga in Papua New Guinea waged wars over negligible patches of land which decimated their male population by 20 to 30% on a yearly basis. This trade-off cannot be reasoned off to a purely biological need for sustenance. This was a conscious choice made by the May Enga, in spite of the risks, and in spite of the disparity between the paltry spaces of land and the cost to human life. Sometimes we have to accept that human beings do not always make decisions based on rational or adaptive strategies. In fact, there are many examples where both primitive and modernized people have consciously made decisions that have contributed to their own undoing, and what's more, they keep on doing them. A notable example of this is the prevalent belief in witchcraft. Some anthropologists have asserted that these beliefs serve a positive or useful purpose. For example, a belief in witchcraft can promote social solidarity by redirecting attributions of malevolence away from the family, clan, or village and onto a more distant people whom cooperation isn't necessary. Even if this has any truth to it, it still doesn't eradicate the fact that such beliefs have contributed to far more negative consequences than positive ones. Belief in witchcraft has led to increases of social anxiety, paranoia, persecution, and in some cases, the outright eradication of entire peoples and their cultures. One such people were the Xhosa of southern Africa, whose superstitiously derived decisions led to the tragedy of losing 3/4 of their entire population and the loss of their way of life to a foreign power. The Xhosa were originally an independent chiefdom led by a king called Sahili. They subsisted mainly upon their livestock and agriculture. They also had conflicts with the British, who succeeded in forcing them into their northern territories. The Xhosa believed in the existence of witchcraft, a solution that explained all of their personal misfortune and error. They also believed in the power of prophecy. In 1853, a Dutch ship brought infected livestock to port. This disease, known as lung sickness, had already killed off thousands of cattle in Europe, and when the Xhosa caught wind of the contaminated shipment, they sensibly tried to move their cattle away to isolated areas. Nevertheless, due to the virulence of the disease, it spread to the Xhosa's cattle and was killing them to the tune of 5,000 animals per month. To make matters even worse, their grain became infected by a legion of grubs, followed by a bout of torrential rain, damaging 2 important areas for their survival. Prophets typically appear during times of uncertainty, and during this period, several prophets appeared declaring the disease to be the cause of witchcraft, and that as a countermeasure, the Xhosa should kill their cattle and refuse to cultivate their fields to get rid of the curse. Despite their susceptibility to superstition, many Xhosa were not particularly convinced by this assessment. That was until the following year, when a teenage girl called Nongwawuze appeared and repeated the prophecy, urging that the only way to destroy the curse was to destroy their produce. She spoke of the coming of a new millennium, representing the transition out of their malaise and into a new period of health and prosperity. On the given day of the millennium, a red sun would rise with tremendous heat, scorching the earth black before great thunderstorms would come, purifying the disease and the evil witches with it. Upon eradication of the curse, new people would arrive in Xhosa land, bringing with them good cattle and crops. But the semblance of certainty is the curse of prophecy. certainty that stems from the false belief that the cause of the malaise is supernaturally related, and which empowers people with the confidence that they can solve their problems and deliver themselves into a better state of existence than before. This time, it had an effect. Some people made heat-proofed houses and prepared new grain pits for the coming of the new people. But despite the psychological effect that the prophecy made on them, killing all their livestock was still too great a request. Cattle were the currency of their economy and were the medium in the arrangement of marriages and important ceremonies. Plus, prophecies had gone wrong in the past, so why wager it all on this one? However, the women, seeing opportunity for emancipation from their agricultural duties, accepted Nongwawuze's foretelling by refusing to work. They also encouraged their husbands to kill the cattle that they still had left. On the fated day of the new millennium, the day passed by as normal, but the prophet was able to rationalize this away by saying that until all the cattle had been killed, then the day of the golden era would not come, and they would dwell in their current dilemma. Then came a critical event. King Sahili gave the order to cull all of his personal herd. Upon hearing of this, many other Xhosa followed suit and began mass slaughtering their herds as well. This legitimized the prophecy's inexorable promise of the coming golden age, causing the people to grow complacent, reveling in singing, drinking beer, and gouging themselves on beef. By December of 1856, those who had taken part in the mass culling of the livestock started to die off from starvation. Dogs fed on dead bodies that were littered everywhere. Some resorted to cannibalizing their own children. Before the time of the disease that was imported to Xhosaland, there were an estimated 105,000 people living in the kingdom. Following these events, there were approximately 25,000 left. In addition to the cattle that fell to the disease, a further 400,000 animals were deliberately slaughtered by the hands of the very people who relied on these animals for their survival, culture, and kingdom. The final nail in the coffin of their way of life came when British officials, seeing opportunity in the Xhosa's impoverished state, forcibly appropriated 600,000 acres of land from them. Their political independence came to an end as well, eventually succumbing completely to foreign rule. Spurred on by the ravings of a teenager, the Xhosa and their king had lost everything. It cost them more than just their economy. It cost them their very identity and independence as a sovereign people. These are only a few examples from dozens that are contained within Robert Edgerton's book Six Societies. They all demonstrate, in the spirit of a truly honest anthropologist, the image of human beings behind the caricatures that we make of them. Ironically, it took another anthropologist to dispel many of the misconceptions that have been created by anthropologists themselves, and by those academics who have used an idealized image of the other to qualify their own pre-established ideas. Ideally, anthropology would be the impartial study of universal human groups and cultures. Unfortunately, it's nearly impossible to get human beings to separate themselves from the information that they derive through observation, meaning that reported findings will often be returned as a strange admixture between data, personal inference, and unconscious biases. Returning back to the original video that inspired this one, a very astute viewer left a comment stating that primitive people are not some romantic window into our past, they are windows into our present. And that's a very succinct way of putting it. Tribal societies do not represent an image of human life unspoilt by modernity. In fact, by this stage, most of these societies have been deeply shaped by the modern world and the effects of the global industrial project. Yet this doesn't alienate them from their humanity whatsoever, and their all-too-human capacity to foster ideas that engender dysfunctional behaviour to emerge. I would further add to this that the romanticisation of the primitive is itself an outgrowth of a modern psyche that feels dissociated from its archaic ligament, reaching out to a semblance of the past that it feels that it is lost or long forgotten. We manufacture such fantasies and imprint them into our media, festooning our culture with the collective dream images of what we feel our lives have lost. And even if those fantasies represent a manufactured illusion that isn't really there, it still speaks to something that is there, which is the penetrating emptiness at the centre of modern life, the enduring lament at having gained so much in the transition from the old world to the new, and yet finding that the very thing that we were lacking is that which the human spirit requires. So I can't really blame modern people for trying to manufacture anesthetics to ease the pain of their dilemmas, but it confuses the issue of understanding our own humanity when we create idealizations of the other and present them as honest representations through which we can recapture some lost semblance of ourselves. The real anthropological view, the real honest view, would be to see the self in the other, that beneath the distracting layers of exotica, there is still a complex organism with a complex psychological ecosystem, and that the ultimate problem of learning to live with ourselves will never be claimed until we are ready to put aside our fantasies and face the human in its true splendor, creativity, and horror. Thank you very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.